Welcome, sailor. When a freak ocean surge capsizes a fishing boat off the coast of Puerto Rico, 4 men are left stranded with no radio, no supplies, and a dead emergency beacon. As injuries mount and hours tick by, their only hope for survival lies in a single fishing hook, a torn tarp, and one man's will to defy the impossible.
My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and for 26 years I've worked these waters off Puerto Rico's northeast coast. I've weathered hurricanes, mechanical failures, and equipment breakdowns that would send most men running back to shore. But nothing prepared me for what happened on March 15th, when our emergency beacon failed and I had to watch 3 men's lives hang in the balance while relying on nothing but a fishing hook and a torn tarp. The morning started like any other aboard the Santa Maria, our 32-foot commercial fishing vessel. My crew consisted of Miguel Santos, my nephew who'd been fishing with me for 8 years, Carlos Vega, a quiet man in his 50s who knew these waters like the back of his weathered hands, and Tony Morales, barely 22 but with the instincts of a seasoned fisherman. We left Fajardo Harbor at 4:30 a.m., the pre-dawn darkness still thick around us. The weather forecast called for moderate seas with occasional swells, nothing we hadn't handled 1,000 times before. Our destination was a productive fishing ground about 15 miles northeast, where the continental shelf drops into deeper waters and the yellowfin tuna run thick. "Mac, you see that weather front moving in from the east?" Miguel called out from the bow, pointing toward a line of darker clouds barely visible on the horizon. I checked the marine radio for updates. The Coast Guard was reporting moderate weather conditions with winds up to 20 knots, well within our vessel's capabilities. "We'll keep an eye on it," I told him, "but we've got a good window to work." The Santa Maria cut through the moderate swells with steady rhythm. She wasn't the newest boat in the harbor, but she was reliable. I'd bought her 12 years ago from an old-timer who'd maintained her like his own child. Twin diesel engines, modern fish-finding electronics, and most importantly, a recently inspected emergency beacon system that had been certified just 3 months earlier. The boat held memories for me. Every scratch on her hull told a story of successful fishing trips, storms weathered and challenges overcome. She had been my livelihood, my second home, and my connection to a tradition that stretched back to my grandfather's generation. By 6:15 a.m., we reached our fishing grounds. The sun was beginning to paint the eastern sky in soft oranges and pinks, casting long shadows across the gently rolling waves. Carlos had already begun preparing the longline gear while Tony checked our ice storage. Everything was proceeding normally, textbook even. "Water temperature's perfect," Miguel reported, monitoring our fish finder. "Showing good activity about 60 feet down." The electronic display showed the telltale marks of fish schools moving through the area. After 26 years, I could read those displays like a book, interpreting the digital blips and understanding what they meant for our day's catch. The conditions were ideal: water temperature at 78 degrees, good current movement, and active fish at the right depth. We began deploying our lines, each one carefully baited and weighted for the specific depth we were targeting. This was the routine we'd perfected over years of working together. Each man knowing his role, moving with practiced efficiency that came from mutual trust and shared experience. Carlos worked with the methodical precision of someone who'd been fishing these waters since before I was born. Tony, despite his youth, had the natural instincts that couldn't be taught. Miguel moved with the easy confidence of family, someone who'd grown up around boats and understood the ocean's rhythms. "Lines are running clean," Carlos reported, checking the tension on our outriggers. "Currents moving northeast about 2 knots, perfect for what we're after." I adjusted our position slightly, using the GPS to maintain our exact location over a submerged ridge that had consistently produced good catches. The Santa Maria responded smoothly to the helm, her twin diesels purring with the reliable rhythm that had carried us safely through hundreds of fishing trips. But the ocean had other plans. At 7:42 a.m., I noticed the barometric pressure on our instruments dropping faster than I'd ever seen. The digital readout showed a fall of nearly 15 millibars in just 20 minutes. A rate of change that indicated something unusual was happening with the weather system approaching us. The weather front that had seemed distant an hour earlier was moving toward us with unusual speed, its dark clouds now towering thousands of feet into the sky. What had been a normal tropical weather system was developing into something more severe, and it was moving faster than the meteorologists had predicted. "Miguel, start bringing in the lines," I called out, already moving toward the wheelhouse to fire up the engines. "We need to head back." Miguel and Tony began the process of retrieving our gear, working quickly but carefully to avoid losing expensive equipment. Carlos secured loose items on deck, his movements showing the urgency he felt even though his expression remained calm. I started the engines and began plotting a course back to Fajardo Harbor. The GPS showed we were exactly 14.7 miles from shore, a distance that normally represented about an hour and 20 minutes of travel time in moderate seas. That's when I saw it. At 7:43 a.m., something appeared on the horizon that defied everything I knew about ocean behavior. It wasn't a normal wave or even a large swell. It was a wall of water unlike anything I'd witnessed in over 2 decades at sea, a massive displacement that seemed to rise from nowhere, moving toward us like a liquid mountain. The wave was wrong in every way. It came from a direction that didn't match the wind patterns. It moved with a speed that didn't correspond to any normal wave physics. And its size, easily 15 feet higher than anything else on the water, suggested forces at work far beneath the surface. "Everyone hold on," I shouted, but my words were lost in the sudden roar of wind and water that preceded the surge. I spun the wheel hard to starboard, trying to take the wave at an angle rather than head-on. The Santa Maria responded immediately, but I could see we weren't going to have enough time or distance to position ourselves properly. The surge hit us at 7:44 a.m. One moment the Santa Maria was cutting steadily through moderate seas, and the next we were airborne, completely out of the water, spinning like a toy in a bathtub. The force of the impact threw Carlos against the stern railing so hard I heard the crack of breaking ribs over the chaos. Tony disappeared beneath a torrent of green water that swept across our deck with the force of a freight train. The sensation of being airborne in a 32-foot vessel is something that violates every law of physics you think you understand about boats and water. For perhaps 3 seconds we were flying, completely disconnected from the ocean that had been supporting us, spinning through the air with no control over our trajectory or landing. When the vessel came down, she landed sideways. I felt the sickening lurch as she began to roll, her center of gravity shifted by the thousands of gallons of water that had flooded our deck and hold. The Santa Maria had been designed to handle rough seas, but not to be thrown through the air and land off balance. In those few seconds, I knew we were going over. The angle of the deck, the way the water was rushing across our gunnels, the terrible grinding sound of equipment breaking loose in the hold, everything told me that 26 years of my life was about to disappear beneath the waves. "Get to the life preservers," I yelled, but the boat was already past the point of no return. The Santa Maria rolled completely over, her hull now pointing toward the sky, her wheelhouse disappearing beneath the surface along with everything we depended on for survival and communication. I found myself underwater, disoriented, my lungs burning as I fought to reach the surface. The water was surprisingly clear, and I could see the dark shadow of our overturned hull above me, blocking out the sunlight. Equipment was floating everywhere. Life preservers, pieces of deck furniture, and debris from the wheelhouse that had been smashed during the rollover. When I finally broke through, gasping and choking on salt water, I saw the others scattered around what remained of our vessel, an overturned hull that was already beginning to settle lower in the water as air escaped from the compartments below. Miguel was closest to me, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead where he'd been thrown against something during the rollover. The cut was deep, running from his hairline down to his left eyebrow, and I could see it would need medical attention to heal properly. Carlos was floating face down about 20 feet away, not moving. His life preserver was keeping him on the surface, but his body position and stillness told me he was unconscious and possibly seriously injured. Tony was clinging to a piece of decking, conscious but clearly in shock. His eyes were wide with disbelief, and I could see he was struggling to process what had just happened to us. "Carlos." I swam toward him as fast as I could, fighting against the waves and the drag of my waterlogged clothes. When I reached him, I flipped him over and checked for breathing. He was unconscious but alive, a weak pulse at his neck. His breathing was shallow and labored, with a wet, rattling sound that told me his broken ribs had likely punctured a lung. This was our reality now, 4 men in the open ocean 15 miles from shore, with our vessel sinking beneath us and no way to call for help. Everything we had depended on for safety and survival, our radio, our emergency equipment, our shelter, was either destroyed or disappearing into the depths. The water temperature was about 78 degrees, warm enough to prevent immediate hypothermia but cold enough to sap our strength over time. In these conditions, we had maybe 18 to 20 hours before exhaustion would start claiming lives, and that was assuming we could stay together and maintain our energy. I reached for the emergency beacon that should have been floating free from its mounting bracket. The bright orange device was designed to automatically activate when it hit the water, immediately beginning to transmit our position to the Coast Guard's Rescue Coordination Center. My hands found the beacon floating near the overturned hull, and I activated it immediately. The indicator light should have shown green, signaling that our distress call was being transmitted to the Coast Guard via satellite. Instead, the light remained dark. I tried again, checking the battery compartment and the antenna deployment. The beacon had been damaged in the rollover, its internal electronics destroyed by salt water intrusion through a crack in the housing that should have been watertight. Our primary means of calling for help was dead. "Mac, what do we do?" Miguel asked, treading water beside me, his voice tight with fear I'd never heard from him before. Blood from his head wound was mixing with the salt water, creating pink streams that dissipated quickly in the current. I looked around at what we had: a rapidly sinking hull for life preservers, a torn section of tarp that had broken free from our equipment cover, and in my pocket, a single fishing hook that had somehow stayed with me through the chaos. The nearest shipping lane was 12 miles south of our position. The Coast Guard wouldn't begin looking for us until we failed to return to port this evening, and they'd have no idea where to search without a beacon signal. Our families knew our general fishing area, but 15 miles northeast of Fajardo, covered hundreds of square miles of open ocean. We were on our own, and I was the only one who understood just how desperate our situation had become. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, already beginning to beat down on us with the intensity that makes the Caribbean a paradise for tourists and a potential death trap for castaways. Without shelter, we would be fighting dehydration and sun exposure along with everything else. I made a decision that would define the next 3 days of our lives. Instead of letting panic set in, instead of focusing on everything we had lost, I would concentrate on what we still had and how we could use it to survive. The fishing hook in my pocket was a 4/0 stainless steel hook, about 1.5 inches long with a sharp point and a strong shank. I'd been using it earlier to adjust some rigging, and it had ended up in my pocket when the surge hit us. Looking at that simple piece of metal, I remembered something my grandfather had taught me 40 years ago, back when I was just a boy learning to fish in the shallows near Culebra. "Mijo," he'd said, "the ocean provides everything you need if you're smart enough to see it." At the time, I thought he was talking about fish and the abundance of the sea. Now, floating in the open ocean with 3 injured men depending on me, I began to understand what he really meant. The Santa Maria disappeared beneath the surface at 8:23 a.m., exactly 39 minutes after the surge hit us. I watched 26 years of my life sink into the dark water, taking with it our radio, our safety equipment, our food supplies, and any hope of conventional rescue. The hull went down slowly at first, then accelerated as the remaining air pockets gave way to incoming water. In those final moments, I could see pieces of our equipment floating up from the submerged compartments. A fishing net, some tools, fragments of things that had once been essential to our livelihood. Carlos had regained consciousness but was in bad shape. Each breath came with that wet, rattling sound that told me his lung was filling with fluid. Miguel was holding him up, but I could see my nephew was struggling. The gash on his forehead was deeper than I'd first thought, and he was showing signs of concussion. Slight confusion, difficulty focusing his eyes, and occasional dizziness that made treading water more difficult. Tony, the youngest of us, was fighting panic. "They're coming for us, right, Mac? The Coast Guard knows we're out here? They have to know something's wrong." I had to make a decision that would haunt me for the rest of this ordeal. Tell them the truth about our beacon failure and risk losing their will to survive, or give them hope while I figured out how to keep us alive long enough for rescue to find us. "They'll start looking when we don't return tonight," I said, which was true. "But we need to help ourselves first. We can't just float here and wait." The truth was more complicated. Our families would expect us back by sunset, around 7:30 p.m. When we didn't return, they'd wait until maybe 9 p.m. before calling the Coast Guard, thinking we might have stopped for fuel or encountered minor delays. The Coast Guard would then have to verify we were actually overdue, contact other vessels in the area, and begin organizing a search pattern. Realistically, we were looking at maybe 16 hours before active searching began, and even then they'd be looking for a 32-foot vessel, not 4 men floating in life preservers in hundreds of square miles of open ocean. The water temperature was 78 degrees, warm enough to prevent immediate hypothermia, but cold enough to sap our strength over time. In these conditions, we had maybe 18 to 20 hours before exhaustion would start claiming lives. After that, even with life preservers, we'd begin losing the ability to keep our heads above water. I pulled out the fishing hook from my pants pocket. A simple steel hook, size 4/0, that I'd been using to adjust equipment earlier that morning. It was the only tool I had, and somehow it would need to become the foundation of our survival. The torn tarp floating near us was about 6 feet by 4 feet, heavy canvas material with several small tears but mostly intact. It had been covering some of our deck equipment and had broken free during the rollover. I swam over and grabbed it, an idea already forming in my mind. Miguel, can you help me gather these life preservers together? We tied the preservers in a rough square using the tarp's remaining tie-down cords and some line that had floated up from the wreckage. It wasn't much, but it created a small platform where Carlos could rest without having to tread water constantly. Every minute we could reduce his exertion was a minute longer his damaged lung might hold out. The work was harder than I expected. Tying knots while treading water, coordinating with Miguel while he fought dizziness from his head injury, keeping Tony calm enough to help instead of panic, it all required more energy than we could really afford to spend. But by 9:15 a.m., I had our makeshift raft arranged. Carlos was lying across two life preservers, his breathing still labored but more stable. Miguel and Tony were positioned on either side, helping to keep the platform steady in the rolling swells. The immediate crisis was stabilized, but I knew this wasn't enough. We needed water, we needed signaling capability, and most critically, we needed a way to attract attention from any passing aircraft or vessels. That's when I remembered something my grandfather had taught me 40 years ago. He'd been a fisherman during much harder times, when equipment was scarce and men had to improvise solutions to problems that could mean the difference between bringing home dinner or going hungry. The fishing hook wasn't just a tool, it was a key to survival. I began working on the tarp, using the hook to carefully enlarge one of the existing tiers. The canvas was tough, waterproofed and designed to withstand marine conditions, but by working slowly and using the hook's sharp point, I could control the direction of the tear. "What are you doing?" Tony asked, his voice carrying less panic now that he could see I had a plan. "Making us a water collector," I explained, continuing to work. "When it rains, and it will rain, we'll need a way to catch and store fresh water." Miguel understood immediately. "Smart. But how do we keep it clean? Salt contamination will make us sicker." I had thought of that too. Using the hook, I carefully separated some threads from the tarp's edge, creating primitive but effective filters. The idea was to create multiple layers of fabric that would strain out the largest particles and salt spray contamination. It wasn't perfect, but it would remove the biggest contaminants and give us a better chance of collecting drinkable water. More importantly, it gave us something to work toward, a reason to believe we could influence our own survival. The work required patience and precision. Each modification to the tarp had to be carefully planned. One wrong cut and we could destroy our water collection capability entirely. The hook was small and required delicate manipulation, especially while floating in moving water. After an hour and 20 minutes of careful work, we had our first piece of survival equipment. A water collection system that could potentially keep us hydrated if the weather cooperated. The system consisted of a large collection area that funneled into a smaller reservoir, with basic filtration to remove the worst contamination. By 10:30 a.m., we had our first piece of survival equipment completed, but the real test of the hook's value came when I spotted something that made my heart race with hope. About 50 yards away, partially submerged, was a piece of our wheelhouse, specifically the section that contained our emergency flare storage. If those flares had survived the sinking, and if I could reach them, we'd have a way to signal for help when rescue aircraft or vessels came within range. "I'm going to swim over to that debris," I told the others. "Carlos, you stay on the raft. Miguel, Tony, keep him stable and watch for any changes in his breathing." The swim was harder than I expected. The swells were increasing as the weather system continued to move through the area, and the debris was drifting away from us almost as fast as I could swim toward it. The current was stronger than I'd realized, and I had to adjust my course several times to compensate. When I finally reached the floating debris, I found the flare compartment flooded and damaged. The flares themselves were waterlogged and useless. Their waterproof seals had failed during the violent rollover, and the chemical compounds inside had been contaminated beyond any hope of ignition. But attached to the same panel was something even more valuable, a piece of reflective aluminum sheeting from our instrument housing. It had been part of the GPS display assembly, designed to reduce glare and improve visibility in bright sunlight. I used the fishing hook to carefully pry the aluminum free, working to preserve as large a piece as possible. The metal was thin but durable, and if I could remove it intact, it would make an excellent signal mirror. The work required 15 minutes of careful manipulation, using the hook to work around rivets and adhesive without tearing the delicate material. Several times I nearly lost the piece to sudden wave action, but eventually I had a sheet about 18 inches square. Not perfect, but potentially visible to aircraft if used correctly. The swim back was exhausting. The others helped pull me onto our makeshift raft, and I could see the worry in Miguel's eyes as he noticed how much the exertion had drained me. I was no longer a young man, and the physical demands of survival were taking their toll. "We have a signal mirror," I announced, showing them the aluminum sheet. "But we need to be smart about when and how we use it." Carlos, despite his injuries, was still thinking clearly. "Save it for when we actually see something," he whispered, his voice weak but determined. "Don't waste energy signaling empty ocean." He was absolutely right. The psychological temptation would be to constantly signal, hoping someone might see us. But that would exhaust us and potentially damage our only signaling device through overuse. By noon, the sun was directly overhead and brutally hot. The same water temperature that was preventing hypothermia was now working against us in a different way, reflecting heat and light that was slowly cooking us from above and below. The sun's reflection off the water created a glare that was almost unbearable, and I could feel my skin beginning to burn despite my natural tan and years of sun exposure. Tony, with his lighter complexion, was already showing signs of serious sunburn. I used the fishing hook again, this time to create small vents in the tarp that we could position to provide shade without compromising our water collection capability. It required precise work. Too large and we'd lose water collection efficiency. Too small and we'd get no relief from the sun. The venting system I created allowed air to flow through the tarp while maintaining the structural integrity needed for both shade and water collection. It was a delicate balance, but after 30 minutes of careful work, we had a shelter that provided some relief from the direct sunlight. "Mac," Tony said quietly, "how long do you think we can last out here?" I looked at each of them, Miguel with his head wound that needed stitches, Carlos with his punctured lung and broken ribs, Tony fighting off panic and severe sunburn, and myself feeling the first edges of exhaustion creeping in. "As long as we need to," I replied. "But we're going to have to get creative." At 1:15 p.m., I spotted our first potential rescue opportunity. A commercial aircraft, probably a cargo flight heading toward San Juan, was visible as a distant speck against the blue sky. Too high and too far away to see us, but it proved that air traffic was passing through our area. I didn't use the signal mirror. The aircraft was clearly at cruising altitude, probably 30,000 feet or higher, and our small signal would be invisible from that distance. But I made note of the time and direction, starting to build a mental picture of traffic patterns that might help us later. Understanding air traffic patterns could be crucial for timing our signaling efforts. If commercial flights followed predictable routes through our area, we might be able to anticipate when to watch for lower-flying aircraft that might spot us. By 2:30 p.m., Carlos was getting worse. His breathing was becoming more labored, and I could see a grayish tint to his skin that told me his body wasn't getting enough oxygen. The water in his lung was accumulating, and without medical intervention, he was slowly drowning from the inside. The wet rattling in his chest was getting more pronounced, and each breath seemed to require more effort than the last. I knew that if the fluid continued to accumulate, he would go into respiratory failure within hours. That's when I realized the fishing hook might serve another purpose, one I'd never imagined and hoped I'd never have to attempt. "Miguel," I said quietly, pulling my nephew aside, "we might need to help Carlos breathe. I've seen it done in emergency medical situations, but..." Miguel's eyes widened as he understood what I was suggesting. "Mac, you're not qualified for that. None of us are. What if you make it worse?" He was absolutely right. What I was considering was an emergency thoracentesis, using the fishing hook to drain fluid from Carlos's lung cavity. It was a procedure normally performed by trained medical professionals with sterile equipment and controlled conditions. But watching Carlos slowly suffocate wasn't an option either. His condition was deteriorating steadily, and if I didn't act soon, we'd lose him regardless of the risks involved in attempting the procedure. I spent the next hour observing Carlos carefully, trying to determine if his condition was stabilizing or continuing to deteriorate. I watched his breathing rate, the color of his lips and fingernails, and the effort required for each breath. By 3:45 p.m. I had my answer. He was getting worse, and if I didn't act soon, we'd lose him. The hook would need to become a medical instrument, and I would need to become a field surgeon, using nothing but basic anatomy knowledge I'd picked up over the years in desperate necessity. I had seen this procedure performed twice, once during my mandatory Coast Guard medical training 15 years ago, and once during a fishing accident when a man had been crushed by shifting cargo. Both times, it had been performed by trained medics with proper equipment. Now I would attempt it with a fishing hook in the middle of the ocean on a makeshift raft. As I prepared for what might be the most important use of that simple fishing hook, I wondered if my grandfather could have imagined his old lesson about the ocean providing everything we needed would ever be tested so severely. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and our first night at sea was approaching. We'd survived the first crucial hours, but the real test was just beginning. By 4:30 p.m. Carlos was dying. His lips had turned blue, and each breath was a struggle that seemed to take more effort than the last. The rattling in his chest had become a wet, choking sound that told me his lung was filling faster than his body could compensate. I'd been watching him deteriorate for hours, running through every alternative I could think of. I had considered trying to fashion some kind of breathing aid, repositioning him to help drainage, even attempting primitive CPR techniques. But there were no alternatives that would address the fundamental problem. Fluid was accumulating in his pleural cavity, and without drainage he would drown in his own bodily fluids. Miguel, Tony, I called them over, keeping my voice low enough that Carlos couldn't hear. I need to try something. It's dangerous, but doing nothing is guaranteed death. Miguel knew what I was planning. Mac, if you puncture the wrong spot, you could hit his heart, his liver, a major blood vessel. Then we'll have tried everything we could, I finished. But if his lung doesn't drain, he's gone anyway. Tony looked confused. What are you talking about? I explained what I was planning to attempt. Carlos has fluid building up around his lung from the broken ribs. I need to drain it or he'll suffocate. I'm going to use the fishing hook to create a small drainage hole. Tony's face went pale. You're going to stab him with a fishing hook? I'm going to save his life, I corrected. If I can. I'd seen this procedure performed twice. Once during my mandatory Coast Guard medical training 15 years ago, and once during a fishing accident when a man had been crushed by shifting cargo. Both times, it had been performed by trained medics with proper equipment. Both times, it had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. Now I would attempt it with a fishing hook in the middle of the ocean, on a makeshift raft made of life preservers and torn canvas. I spent 20 minutes preparing the hook, using seawater to clean it as thoroughly as possible, then letting the sun's heat sterilize the metal. I rubbed it with the cleanest piece of cloth I could find, removing any debris or contamination. It wasn't medical-grade sterile, but it was the best I could do under the circumstances. The salt water would actually help prevent infection. It's naturally antiseptic, though not something you'd want to rely on for major surgery. Carlos, I said, moving beside him on our platform. I need to help you breathe. This is going to hurt, but it might save your life. He nodded weakly, his eyes showing he understood the situation as well as any of us. Carlos had been around fishing boats long enough to see serious injuries, and he knew what internal trauma could do to a man. I positioned my fingers on his chest, feeling for the landmarks I remembered from training. Fourth intercostal space, midaxillary line. The spot where I could theoretically access the pleural cavity without hitting major blood vessels or organs. The anatomy was more difficult to locate than I'd expected. Carlos was a heavy-set man, and the landmarks weren't as prominent as they'd been on the training mannequins I'd practiced on years ago. I had to rely on counting ribs and estimating angles, knowing that one mistake could be fatal. My hands were shaking. Not from the cold or the motion of the ocean, but from the weight of what I was about to attempt. One mistake and I could kill the man I was trying to save. Hesitate too long and he'd die anyway. Hold him steady, I instructed Miguel and Tony. Then, with a prayer I hadn't said since childhood, I inserted the fishing hook. Carlos screamed, a sound that cut through the ocean noise and seemed to hang in the air forever. It was a sound of pure agony, but also of a man fighting to live. The hook penetrated his skin, then the muscle layer, then finally the pleural membrane. Almost immediately, I heard what I was hoping for, the hiss of escaping air and fluid. Blood and fluid began draining from the small puncture wound, relieving the pressure that had been crushing his lung and preventing him from breathing normally. Carlos's breathing, which had been getting shallower by the hour, suddenly deepened. Color began returning to his face as oxygen finally reached his bloodstream effectively. The blue tint faded from his lips, and the terrible rattling sound in his chest quieted. I held the hook in place for several minutes, allowing the pressure to equalize and as much fluid as possible to drain. When the flow slowed to a trickle, I carefully withdrew the hook and used a small piece of torn cloth to cover the wound. The relief was overwhelming, but I knew our situation was still critical. I'd bought Carlos time, maybe hours or even days, but we were still 15 miles from shore with no way to signal for help and limited supplies. How do you feel? I asked Carlos. Like I got stabbed with a fishing hook, he replied, and despite everything we all managed to laugh. But I can breathe. The laughter was partly relief, partly hysteria, and partly the natural human response to surviving something that should have killed us. For a few moments, we weren't desperate castaways. We were just four men who had beaten the odds through luck and determination. At 5:15 p.m., our water situation became urgent. We'd been in the sun for nearly 10 hours and dehydration was starting to affect all of us. My lips were cracked, Tony was showing early signs of heat exhaustion, and Miguel's head wound wasn't healing properly in the salt environment. The human body loses water constantly through breathing, sweating, and other normal functions. In hot, sunny conditions like we were experiencing, that loss accelerates dramatically. Without replacement, we were looking at maybe 12 to 18 hours before dehydration would start affecting our judgment and physical capabilities. That's when the afternoon weather pattern provided our first break. I noticed clouds building to the southwest, not the dangerous storm clouds that had capsized us, but the typical afternoon thunderheads that develop over Puerto Rico's mountains and move offshore. These were the daily weather patterns I'd observed for 26 years, and if they held true, we might see rain within the next hour. "Those clouds are moving our way," I announced, pointing toward the developing weather system. "We need to get ready to collect water." I repositioned our tarp to maximize water collection, using the fishing hook to create additional channels that would direct rainwater into our improvised reservoir. Every modification had to be precise. One mistake and we could lose precious water to poor drainage or contamination. The work required another hour of careful manipulation. I used the hook to create small gutters along the edges of the tarp, ensuring that water would flow toward our collection point rather than running off the sides. I also reinforced the corners to prevent tearing under the weight of accumulated water. Miguel and Tony helped by testing the water flow system, using small amounts of seawater to trace the drainage patterns and identify any areas where precious fresh water might be lost. At 6:02 p.m., the first drops began to fall. "Everyone stay still," I instructed. "Let the first few minutes wash the salt off the tarp, then we'll start collecting." It was torture, watching fresh water hit our collection system and overflow back into the ocean while our bodies screamed for hydration. But I knew that drinking salt-contaminated water would make us sicker faster than remaining thirsty. Salt water poisoning is insidious. It starts with increased thirst, then progresses to nausea, weakness, and eventually kidney failure. In our weakened condition, even small amounts of salt contamination could push us over the edge into medical crisis. After 5 minutes, I judged the tarp sufficiently rinsed. "Now," I said, and we began our first water collection. The rain lasted 23 minutes. When it stopped, we had approximately 2 liters of fresh water. Not much for 4 men, but enough to prevent immediate dehydration crisis. We rationed it carefully, small sips every 30 minutes, just enough to keep our bodies functioning. Carlos, because of his medical condition, got slightly larger portions, but even so, we were looking at maybe 6 hours of hydration. The water tasted like life itself. After hours of salt spray and dehydration, that first sip of fresh rainwater was the most precious thing I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just hydration, it was proof that we could survive, that the ocean could provide what we needed if we were smart enough to capture it. As evening approached, I used the fishing hook for another critical purpose: fishing. I knew the waters around our position held small fish that stayed near floating debris. Our overturned raft was attracting marine life, and I could see small movements in the water that indicated fish were gathering underneath us. Using threads pulled from the tarp as line and a small piece of torn fabric as bait, I created a basic fishing setup. The hook was larger than ideal for the small fish I was targeting, but it was functional. "You really think you can catch something with that?" Tony asked, his voice showing more hope than skepticism. "My grandfather caught dinner with less," I replied, lowering the improvised line into the water. The fishing required patience we could barely afford. Every minute spent trying to catch food was a minute not spent on other survival tasks, but we needed protein and fat to maintain our strength for what was likely to be a long ordeal. The first hour produced nothing but small nibbles that got away. The hook was too large for most of the fish investigating our bait, and the improvised line wasn't strong enough to handle anything substantial. But at 8:47 p.m., just as the sun was touching the horizon, I felt the unmistakable tug of a fish taking the bait. It was small, maybe 6 inches long, but it was protein and fat that our bodies desperately needed. I used the fishing hook to clean and prepare the fish, sharing the raw meat among the 4 of us. It wasn't pleasant, but it was nutritious and safe. I'd eaten raw fish countless times during my years at sea, and I knew how to identify fish that were safe to consume raw. "Tomorrow we'll catch more," I told them as we settled in for our first night on the water. But as darkness fell completely, I realized that surviving the night would bring challenges I hadn't fully considered. The ocean temperature was dropping, the swells were increasing, and maintaining our makeshift raft in the darkness would require constant vigilance. The sounds of the ocean changed at night. What had been the steady rhythm of waves during daylight became an unpredictable symphony of splashes, gurgles, and mysterious movements in the water around us. Every sound could represent danger or rescue. More critically, I could see lights on the horizon, the glow of San Juan to the south and smaller coastal communities to the west. We were close enough to civilization to see it, but still impossibly far from rescue. The lights were both encouraging and heartbreaking. They represented warmth, safety, medical care, and everything we needed to survive. But they might as well have been on the moon for all the good they did us floating in the middle of the ocean. At 10:15 p.m., I spotted something that made my heart race. Navigation lights of what appeared to be a Coast Guard vessel, maybe 4 miles away, moving in a search pattern. This was it. Our chance. I grabbed the aluminum signal mirror and began reflecting the light from our small emergency lantern. A waterproof LED light that had been clipped to Miguel's life preserver and had survived the capsizing. Flash, 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 pause, flash, flash, flash. The international distress signal, repeated over and over until my arms ached from holding the mirror steady against the motion of our makeshift raft. The technique required precise timing and steady hands. Too fast and the signal would be unreadable. Too slow and it might be dismissed as random reflection. I had to maintain the rhythm while compensating for the movement of our platform and the distant vessel. For 27 minutes, I signaled toward those distant lights, watching as they moved slowly across the horizon. Miguel and Tony added their voices, shouting into the darkness even though they knew sound wouldn't carry that far. The psychological effect of shouting was important, though. It gave them something active to do, a way to feel like they were contributing to their own rescue rather than just waiting passively for death or salvation. The lights continued their pattern and eventually disappeared beyond the horizon. They hadn't seen us, but something important had happened. The search pattern was systematic, which meant our families had reported us overdue and the Coast Guard was actively looking for us. Help was out there, we just had to survive long enough to be found. "They're looking," Carlos said quietly from his position on the raft. "That means people know we're missing. Tomorrow there will be more." He was right. The Coast Guard search patterns would expand, bringing more vessels and aircraft into our area. Each passing hour increased our chances of being spotted, assuming we could maintain our strength and our signaling capability. At 11:43 p.m., as we prepared for the long night ahead, I realized that the fishing hook had already saved our lives 3 times. By helping me create our water collection system, by allowing me to help Carlos breathe, and by providing us with food. But the night was young and the ocean had more tests waiting for us. The darkness brought new terrors I hadn't anticipated. Without the sun's heat, the ocean seemed to come alive with sounds and movements that set every nerve on edge. What had been manageable swells during daylight became invisible walls of water that lifted us high into the night air, then dropped us sickeningly into valleys between waves. The sensory deprivation was almost overwhelming. Unable to see the horizon or judge the size of approaching waves, we were constantly surprised by the motion of our makeshift raft. One moment we'd be in a relatively calm trough, and the next we'd be riding the crest of a swell that felt enormous in the darkness. At 12:30 a.m., our makeshift raft encountered its first real test. A series of larger swells, probably the remnant energy from a distant weather system, began hitting us from 2 different directions. The result was chaos, waves that seemed to come from everywhere at once, threatening to tear apart our carefully constructed platform. "Hold on to the preservers," I shouted over the roar of water, but my voice was lost in the noise. The cross swells created a washing machine effect, with water coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Our raft, which had been stable in the regular wave patterns, was suddenly bucking and twisting like a wild animal. Tony was swept off the raft entirely by a wave that seemed to come from nowhere. I watched him disappear into the darkness, his life preserver the only thing keeping him visible as a pale spot in the black water. Without thinking, I grabbed the longest piece of rope we had, maybe 8 feet of line that had been part of our original tarp rigging, and dove after him. The water was shockingly cold after a day of sun-warmed surface temperatures. Below the first few inches, the ocean was a different world entirely, dark and hostile. I reached Tony just as he was starting to panic, flailing against his life preserver in a way that would have exhausted him within minutes. "Stop fighting," I told him, grabbing his arm. "The preserver will hold you up. Just breathe." Getting back to the raft in the darkness was harder than I'd expected. The swells that had been manageable during daylight were disorienting without visual reference points. Several times I thought we were swimming toward our platform, only to realize we'd been moving parallel to it or even away from it. Miguel's voice, calling our names into the darkness, became our guide. We followed the sound back to safety, arriving exhausted but alive. "We need to tie ourselves together," I said once we were back on the platform. "If someone goes overboard at night, we might not find them again." Using the fishing hook, I began working on the remaining rope and tarp material, creating a safety line system that would keep us connected even if our platform came apart. It was delicate work in the darkness, relying entirely on touch to ensure each knot would hold under stress. The hook became a needle, allowing me to thread line through the heavy canvas material and create attachment points that wouldn't tear loose under sudden strain. Each connection had to be tested carefully because our lives would depend on them. By 2:15 a.m., we had a basic safety system in place. Each of us was connected to the central platform by approximately 6 feet of line. Enough freedom to move, but not enough to get separated if we were thrown clear. The psychological effect was as important as the practical benefit. Being physically connected to each other and to our survival platform provided comfort in the terrifying isolation of the open ocean at night. That's when Carlos started having trouble again. The stress of the rough seas was aggravating his lung injury. His breathing, which had improved dramatically after my emergency procedure, was becoming labored again. I could hear fluid accumulating once more in his chest cavity. "Mac," he whispered, "I think you need to do that thing again." I had hoped the first drainage would be enough, but traumatic pneumothorax often requires multiple interventions. The problem was that each time I used the fishing hook for this purpose, I was increasing the risk of infection or more serious injury. But Carlos was right. His condition was deteriorating rapidly, and without intervention, he'd be in crisis within hours. This time, the procedure was even more difficult because of the rough seas. Maintaining steady pressure and precise positioning while our platform pitched and rolled required Miguel and Tony to essentially immobilize Carlos while I worked. The fishing hook had to penetrate his skin in exactly the right spot, at exactly the right angle, despite the constant movement of our raft. One wrong move and I could puncture something vital. The drainage was immediate and dramatic. Once again, Carlos's breathing improved and color returned to his face. But I could see this was taking a toll on his overall condition. He was getting weaker with each episode, and I wondered how many more times his body could endure this trauma. "How many times can you do that?" Miguel asked quietly. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we'll do it as many times as necessary." The honest answer was that I was terrified. Each procedure was a gamble with Carlos's life, and I had no way of knowing if repeated drainage would eventually cause more harm than good. But the alternative was watching him slowly suffocate, and that wasn't acceptable. At 3:40 a.m., we encountered our first serious wildlife situation. I noticed something moving in the water around our raft, something larger than the small fish I'd been catching. At first I thought it might be dolphins, which would have been welcome company and a sign that we were in healthy ocean waters. But the movement pattern was wrong, more aggressive and predatory than the playful behavior of dolphins. "Everyone stay still," I whispered, recognizing the distinctive dorsal fin cutting through the water near our platform. Sharks. At least 3 of them, probably Caribbean reef sharks drawn by the scent of blood from Carlos's medical procedures and the fish we've been cleaning. Caribbean reef sharks aren't typically aggressive toward humans, but they're opportunistic feeders attracted to blood and distress. In our weakened condition, even a normally docile shark could pose a serious threat. For 27 minutes, they circled our raft. Not aggressively, more curious than threatening, but their presence added a psychological pressure that was almost unbearable. Every time one of us shifted position or a foot dangled in the water, we imagined those dark shapes moving closer. The sharks' behavior was actually educational. They maintained a consistent distance from our raft, suggesting they were investigating rather than hunting. But they also reminded us that we were visitors in their domain, completely dependent on their indifference for our continued survival. I used this time to work with the fishing hook on another project that had been forming in my mind. If we were going to be spending extended time on the water, we needed better tools and more robust equipment. Working by touch in the darkness, I began separating more threads from the tarp material, braiding them into stronger line. It was slow, painstaking work, but it gave me something to focus on besides the predators circling below. The braiding technique was something I'd learned as a child, watching my grandfather repair fishing nets. The key was maintaining consistent tension and creating overlapping patterns that distributed stress across multiple fibers. By dawn, I had created approximately 20 feet of improvised rope, not strong enough for heavy loads, but sufficient for fishing line or emergency repairs to our platform. The sharks disappeared as the sun began to rise, apparently losing interest as the night scents dispersed and the water temperature began to climb. But their visit had reminded us how vulnerable we were, floating on the surface of an ocean filled with creatures perfectly adapted to this environment. At 5:15 a.m., our second sunrise at sea, I took inventory of our situation. Positive, we had survived 36 hours. Our water collection system was functional and had already provided life-saving hydration. We had successfully caught fish and proven our ability to obtain food from the ocean. Carlos's medical condition was manageable with the improvised procedures. We had maintained group cohesion and morale despite extreme stress. Negative, we were showing signs of sun exposure and progressive dehydration. Our improvised raft was holding together but showing stress at the attachment points. We had seen Coast Guard search activity but had been unable to attract their attention. Carlos's repeated medical episodes were weakening him significantly. Most critically, I calculated that we had maybe 2 more days before exhaustion and exposure would start making survival decisions for us. After that, our ability to maintain the raft, catch food, and signal for rescue would diminish rapidly. That's when I spotted something on the horizon that changed everything. At 6:23 a.m., I saw the distinctive silhouette of a Coast Guard helicopter, flying a search pattern approximately 3 miles to our east. It was the first aircraft I'd seen flying low enough and systematically enough to potentially spot survivors. The helicopter was following a grid pattern, methodically covering sections of ocean in overlapping sweeps. This was exactly the kind of organized search activity that gave me hope. They weren't just looking randomly, they had a plan and the resources to execute it. I grabbed the aluminum signal mirror and began flashing the morning sunlight toward the aircraft. Flash, 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 pause, flash, flash, flash. The international distress signal, repeated continuously for as long as the helicopter remained visible. The morning sun provided excellent conditions for signaling. The light was bright and directional, and the angle allowed me to create a strong reflection that should have been visible for miles under the right conditions. For 8 minutes, I maintained the signal, my arms cramping from holding the mirror steady against the motion of our raft. Miguel and Tony waved frantically, using pieces of bright cloth torn from our life preservers to create additional visual signals. The helicopter continued its search pattern and eventually moved beyond the horizon without changing course. They hadn't seen us, but something important had changed. The search pattern was more systematic, more focused than the distant ship lights we'd seen the night before. Someone had narrowed down our probable location based on our known fishing grounds, drift calculations, and search probability models. "They're getting closer," I told the others. "The search area is tightening. Today might be the day." As I prepared to use the fishing hook for our morning meal, both to maintain our strength and to keep our minds occupied, I realized that our survival now depended on a balance between resourcefulness and patience. We had proven we could stay alive with almost nothing. We had created tools, collected water, obtained food, and provided medical care using nothing but a fishing hook and our accumulated knowledge. Now we had to stay alive long enough to be saved. Day 3 began with a crisis that nearly ended everything we'd fought to preserve. At 7:40 a.m., while I was working on extending our fishing line using the braided tarp threads, Carlos suddenly convulsed and began coughing up blood. Not the pink-tinged fluid I'd been expecting from his lung injury, but bright red blood that indicated serious internal bleeding. "Miguel, help me get him positioned," I called, immediately recognizing that Carlos was choking on his own blood. We had to keep his airway clear or lose him in minutes. The convulsion was violent and unexpected. Carlos's entire body went rigid, then began shaking uncontrollably. His eyes rolled back, and the blood that came up was arterial, bright red and flowing freely, suggesting that something had torn loose inside his chest cavity. I used the fishing hook to carefully clear clotted blood from his mouth, a procedure that required steady hands and precise movements while our platform pitched in the morning swells. Each time Carlos coughed, more blood appeared, and I could see his strength fading rapidly. "Mac, what's happening to him?" Tony asked, his voice tight with fear. "Internal bleeding, probably from the rib fractures," I explained while continuing to work. "The broken ribs must have damaged something inside, maybe his spleen or a major blood vessel." This was beyond anything I had prepared for. The lung drainage procedures had been difficult but manageable. This was internal trauma that required surgical intervention I couldn't provide with improvised tools. For 45 minutes, I fought to keep Carlos conscious and breathing. The fishing hook became a surgical instrument again, helping me maintain his airway while Miguel and Tony stabilized our platform against increasingly rough seas. The blood loss was significant. I could see Carlos's skin taking on the pale, grayish color that indicated shock. His pulse was becoming weak and rapid, and his breathing was growing more labored despite my efforts to keep his airway clear. By 8:30 a.m., Carlos had stabilized somewhat, but I could see he was running out of time. The internal injuries were beyond anything I could address with improvised tools. He needed real medical intervention, blood transfusions, surgery, intensive care, and he needed it within hours, not days. How much longer? Carlos whispered, his voice barely audible. Help is coming, I told him, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Just hold on. That's when our luck finally changed. At 9:12 a.m., I spotted something that made my heart race. A Coast Guard cutter on the horizon, moving in a systematic search pattern that would bring it within 2 miles of our position. This was different from the previous sightings. The vessel was clearly conducting an active search, moving slowly and methodically rather than simply transiting the area. They were looking for us specifically, and their search pattern suggested they had narrowed down our probable location. This was our chance. Our best chance. Maybe our only chance, especially with Carlos's condition deteriorating so rapidly. I grabbed the signal mirror and began the most important signaling of my life. But this time, I had a plan that went beyond simple reflection. Using the fishing hook, I had spent the previous evening preparing for this moment. I'd carefully separated metallic threads from our tarp's waterproof coating, creating thin strips of reflective material that could be arranged to enhance our signal mirror's effectiveness. Everyone help me, I instructed. We're going to create the biggest, brightest signal we can manage. Miguel and Tony began waving our brightest pieces of cloth while I arranged the metallic strips around the signal mirror to amplify the reflected sunlight. The fishing hook allowed me to position each strip precisely, creating a focused beam that was significantly brighter than the mirror alone. The enhancement technique was something I'd improvised based on basic physics principles. By creating multiple reflection surfaces arranged at slight angles, I could intensify the signal beam and make it more likely to catch the attention of the search vessel. For 23 minutes, I maintained the enhanced signal, tracking the cutter's movement and adjusting our reflection angle to stay on target. My arms were screaming with fatigue, but I didn't dare stop. The psychological pressure was enormous. This might be our only chance before Carlos's condition became critical, and if we failed to attract attention, we might not get another opportunity for hours or even days. At 9:35 a.m., the impossible happened. The cutter changed course. They had seen us. They're coming. Miguel shouted, and for the first time in 3 days, I heard genuine hope in his voice. The course change was unmistakable. The Coast Guard vessel had been following a north-south search pattern, but now it was heading directly toward our position. The white hull was growing larger by the minute, and I could see crew members on deck preparing rescue equipment. The next 47 minutes were the longest of my life. We could see the Coast Guard vessel approaching, growing larger as it closed the distance, but Carlos was getting worse. His breathing was becoming shallow again, and I could see the grayish pallor that indicated shock from blood loss. I found myself using the fishing hook one more time, clearing his airway and trying to keep him conscious long enough for professional medical help to arrive. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same simple tool that had helped us catch fish and collect water was now being used to perform emergency medical procedures that would have challenged a trained paramedic. "Stay with us, Carlos," I kept repeating. "Help is almost here. Just hold on." Carlos's eyes were losing focus, and his responses were becoming weaker. I could feel his pulse growing more irregular, and I knew we were in a race against time. At 10:22 a.m., the Coast Guard cutter Resolute pulled alongside our makeshift raft. I had never seen anything more beautiful than that white hull and the Coast Guard crew members preparing to pull us from the water. The rescue swimmer hit the water and swam toward us with powerful, efficient strokes. He was wearing a bright orange dry suit and carrying medical equipment that looked impossibly sophisticated compared to our improvised tools. 4 survivors, the rescue swimmer called up to the vessel. 1 critical, needs immediate medical attention. They got Carlos aboard first, and I could hear the medics working on him even as they were pulling the rest of us from the water. Miguel went next, then Tony, and finally me. As I climbed the ladder onto the cutter's deck, I realized I was still clutching the fishing hook that had kept us alive for 3 days. It seemed impossible that something so simple could have been the difference between life and death, but there it was in my palm, bent, discolored by salt water, but still intact. The Coast Guard medics immediately took over Carlos's care, starting IVs, administering oxygen, and stabilizing him for transport. Their efficiency and professionalism were incredible to watch after 3 days of improvised medical care. "Sir, how did you manage to survive for 3 days with so little equipment?" the Coast Guard commander asked as the medics checked me over. I held up the fishing hook. "This," I said. "And knowing that the ocean provides everything you need, if you're smart enough to see it. The commander looked at the simple piece of metal in my hand with newfound respect. Can you walk me through what you did? Over the next hour, as we headed back toward shore, I explained our survival techniques. The water collection system, the fishing methods, the medical procedures, all of it accomplished with a single fishing hook and the determination to survive. The thoracentesis procedures probably saved his life, the Coast Guard medic told me. His lung would have collapsed completely without intervention. Carlos was airlifted to San Juan Medical Center within an hour of our rescue. The helicopter transfer was dramatic. A Coast Guard Jayhawk lowering a basket to the deck of the cutter while we maintained course and speed through moderate seas. The internal bleeding was serious, a ruptured spleen caused by his broken ribs, but the emergency room doctor said that keeping his airway clear and managing his lung injury had probably saved his life. The improvised drainage procedures had bought him enough time to reach definitive medical care. Miguel required 12 stitches for his head wound, and Tony was treated for severe sun exposure and dehydration. I walked away with minor injuries, severe sunburn, and a story I knew I'd be telling for the rest of my life. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of what had happened to us. The Santa Maria was never recovered, but sonar surveys located her hull in 340 feet of water, exactly where our drift calculations suggested she would be. The freak surge that capsized us was caused by an underwater landslide on the continental shelf, triggered by a minor earthquake we never felt. It was a 1-in-a-million event that created a wall of water unlike anything in the Coast Guard's records. Our emergency beacon failed due to a design flaw that was subsequently recalled by the manufacturer. 73 other vessels were found to have the same potentially fatal defect, a saltwater intrusion problem that could disable the beacon's electronics during the violent motion of a vessel in distress. 3 months later, I was back on the water in a new boat with the same crew. Because that's what fishermen do. We go back to the sea knowing it can kill us because it's also what keeps us alive. Carlos returned to fishing after a 6-month recovery. He still can't take deep breaths without some discomfort, but he says it reminds him every day how lucky we all are to be alive. The doctor said he'd lost nearly 30% of his blood volume and would have died within hours without professional medical intervention. Miguel's head wound healed cleanly, leaving only a small scar that he says makes him look more experienced. Tony overcame his psychological trauma with the help of counseling and returned to the water within a month. I still carry a fishing hook in my pocket every time I go out. Not because I think I'll need it for survival, I hope I never face anything like that again, but because it reminds me that sometimes the smallest tools can make the biggest difference. The hook that saved our lives is now mounted in a frame in my kitchen, right next to a photo of my grandfather teaching a 7-year-old boy how to fish in the shallows near Culebra. Every morning when I see it, I remember his words, "Mijo, the ocean provides everything you need if you're smart enough to see it." He never could have imagined how literally those words would one day be tested. But he was right. The ocean had provided everything we needed. The materials for shelter and water collection, the fish for sustenance, even the knowledge and determination required to perform life-saving medical procedures. But most importantly, it had provided the lesson that survival isn't about having the best equipment or the most resources. It's about using what you have, thinking creatively under pressure, and never giving up hope. The beacon never triggered that day in March. The emergency systems we trusted failed us completely. But a simple fishing hook and a torn tarp, combined with 26 years of experience and 3 days of desperate creativity, brought 4 men home alive. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. 6 months after our rescue, the Coast Guard completed their investigation of our accident. The findings were both sobering and enlightening, providing insights that would change maritime safety protocols for years to come. The freak surge that capsized the Santa Maria was caused by an underwater landslide on the continental shelf, triggered by a magnitude 4.2 earthquake centered 40 miles northwest of our position. The earthquake itself was too small to feel at sea level, but it destabilized a section of the continental slope that had been undermined by recent storms. When the underwater slope collapsed, it displaced millions of cubic feet of water, creating a solitary wave that traveled across the ocean floor before erupting to the surface as the surge that hit us. The phenomenon is extremely rare. The Coast Guard investigation found only 3 similar events in their historical records, all in different parts of the world. Our emergency beacon failed due to a design flaw that was subsequently recalled by the manufacturer. The problem was a poorly sealed antenna connection that could fail when exposed to saltwater intrusion during violent motion. 73 other vessels were found to have the same potentially fatal defect. The recall led to new standards for emergency beacon testing and certification. requiring equipment to survive more extreme conditions before approval for maritime use. Our near-death experience had helped prevent similar tragedies for other fishing crews. Carlos's recovery was remarkable but difficult. The internal bleeding had been caused by a displaced rib fragment that punctured his spleen. The emergency room doctor said that keeping his airway clear and managing his pneumothorax had bought him the crucial hours needed to reach surgical intervention. The improvised thoracentesis procedures were textbook perfect. Dr. Martinez, the trauma surgeon, told me during one of Carlos's follow-up appointments. "You probably saved his life twice over, once by draining his lung and again by keeping him stable until we could get to him." Miguel's head injury healed without complications, though he still experiences occasional headaches during weather changes. Tony overcame his psychological trauma through counseling and actually became more confident on the water, saying that surviving our ordeal proved he could handle anything the ocean threw at him. The fishing hook that saved our lives became something of a local legend. The Coast Guard commander included our story in their training materials, using it as an example of resourcefulness and determination under extreme conditions. But for me, the hook represents something deeper. It's a reminder that survival often depends not on having the perfect tools, but on using whatever you have with creativity and determination. It's a testament to the knowledge passed down through generations of fishermen, and to the importance of never giving up hope. I still fish the same waters where we nearly died. The ocean that almost claimed our lives continues to provide our livelihood, because that's the relationship fishermen have always had with the sea. We understand its dangers, but we also know its bounty. Every time I go out, I carry that fishing hook in my pocket. Not because I expect to need it for survival, but because it reminds me of what's possible when ordinary tools are used with extraordinary determination. And because my grandfather was right, the ocean provides everything you need if you're smart enough to see it. The beacon never triggered that day in March. But sometimes, when technology fails and hope seems lost, the simplest tools can become the most important. A fishing hook, a torn tarp, and the will to survive, that's all it took to bring 4 men home from the edge of death. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything.